Good evening, beloved friends, to a very special evening of learning more about our faith here at broadcasting live from Brookville, New York, Living the Resurrection with special guest Dr. George Dimakopoulos. Dr. George and I are friends for many, many years. I know not only him, but his beautiful family. He's the proud father of 4 beautiful children, his wife Kathy. I knew his in-laws of blessed memory, who were such wonderful people. Dr. George, we are delighted this evening that you're going to take us through a journey back in time. And we are, my beloved friends, about to enter into the holiest year, as you know, which is Holy Week, beginning with Saturday of Lazarus in just 2 days. And we know that for our own life experience, this is the way we know things to be. But Dr. George and I had a wonderful conversation, and we thought it would be very interesting as a professor at Fordham University and a real historian to take us back into how was Holy Week celebrated in the 4th century, and what were those elements in the 4th century that perhaps are still very much alive today, that we kind of just figure these things happen, but we really would like to know, was it always the case? What was the case? So, Dr. George, welcome to not only Holy Resurrection, but also to the show, and we look forward to a wonderful evening of learning and education, which is so beautiful.
Thank you, Father. Thank you so much for inviting me. We have been friends for many, many years, probably almost 20 years. I've always learned so much from you, and it's always a joy to be with you. So thank you for having me. So yeah, we'll
maybe before we go to the actual Holy Week, for our viewers even, we live in a world where everything is media, as we are tonight, and lighting, and you drove here. Take us maybe, Doctor, as a first step, what was life like in the 4th century? In a general way. I mean, not only for Christians, but generally. What were the things that were happening in that century?
So if you lived in the Roman Empire in the 4th century, and Jerusalem, Palestine was in the Roman Empire in the 4th century, life would be very, very different than it is today. I mean, some of the most basic things. Life expectancy would have been in the 40s.
Wow.
Okay. No running water in a house, no, right? No beds as we think of beds. I mean, there might be some like straw or some fabric that you might lay on, but no beds as we think of beds. Children would have been married, typically around age 16 or 17 years old. Ordinarily, a woman would probably, if she didn't die in childbirth, a woman would probably have between 6 and 9 children, and maybe a third to a quarter of those wouldn't live to be 6 years old.
Wow.
Right? So you would be, frankly, surrounded by death. There would be death in the house. There would be death in the neighborhood. There would be, death was omnipresent. It was a violent period. Armies and so forth, vandals and robbers, and there was a great deal of violence. I mean, the Romans, although the Romans inflicted a lot of violence on others, the Romans were pretty good about policing, and so they did it through violence, right? Crucifixion, for example, right? The most, crucifixion is honestly probably the most excruciating and painful way that humans have ever come up with to torture someone.
So here at the parish, I don't want you to lose your thought, Doctor. I had said a statement which I believe was correct, based on the little reading that I did, but I'm curious to know from you, was indeed crucifixion reserved kind of for the lowest of class citizens? It was. Okay,
Yes.
because I had said that publicly, and then I
Yes.
thought I better, check that.
That's
just to
true.
make sure.
So it was ordinarily reserved for criminals, for slaves, for peasants, and so forth. A Roman landowner who might be convicted of a crime would be killed by another means, typically beheading, or would be required to perform suicide or something like that. It was, and the thing about crucifixion that we don't need to dwell on this per se, but crucifixion is actually death by suffocation. When you're completely outstretched with the weight of your body, the issue is you can't breathe. And so you very, very slowly die of lack of oxygen. And ordinarily, it would take days. According to the Gospels, in Christ's case, it takes hours, not days. But ordinarily, it would take days, and that's why it was so awful, right? It was just a slow, agonizing way to die. So the 4th century is, it's a period in which, the Roman Empire was more advanced than any empire that had been, right, any civilization that had been before it, right? They have laws, they have writing, they have philosophy, they have drama, right? They have all of these things, much of it borrowed from the Greeks before them and so forth. And yet, it's still a time when life expectancies in the 40s, women suffer violence constantly, their children are dying, right, and so forth. And so it's a very different period than our own.
Right. And at that time, we can say, Doctor, you have, through Constantine the Great, early 4th century, right, a kind of shift towards an openness to Christianity.
Yes.
It's not, I'm assuming there might have been persecutions of Christians somewhere in the empire, but in generally speaking, is it safe to say that Christianity becomes recognized in the empire, okay to be a Christian in the empire?
So this is exactly right. So in the year 313, Constantine, Roman emperor, at this point he's only emperor of the western half of the empire.
Okay.
He passes something called the Edict of Milan, which officially ends the persecution of Christianity in the empire. And his counterpart in the east, a man by the name of Licinius, does the same thing. And so Christianity goes from being a religion that is actively persecuted to one which is now officially tolerated, okay?
It's not the official.
Correct. At the time he did that, our best estimate is that 10% of the population of the Roman Empire had converted to Christianity. And that 10%...
What's the total, just out of curiosity?
About 80 million people.
80 million people.
Maybe 85 million people in the Roman Empire at the time. Okay? Now, of course, there were Christians outside of the Roman Empire as well. We tend to forget about them. But there were a great number of Christians outside of the Roman Empire, in Africa, in the Persian Empire, and so forth. But we're talking about the Roman Empire, okay?
And forgive me, Doctor.
Yeah.
For the sake of those this evening, what
Where is it?
constitutes the Roman Empire?
Okay,
Maybe we could...
so in the 4th century, in the early 4th century, when Constantine is emperor, the borders of the Roman Empire circle the Mediterranean.
Okay.
So Spain, Gaul, modern-day France, Italy, the Balkans, Greece, Asia Minor, Turkey, and then swinging down, right? Then you would have Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia. You're testing me on my geography, right? Across North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya,
no
et cetera,
grades
right?
tonight.
It would also have extended a little bit north in Western Europe to include modern-day France, Austria, Switzerland, and even part of England as well. Yeah, and it would have gone east as far as, well, depending on the year, because there's the Persian Empire, right? Is right. It's buttressed up against the Persian Empire. It certainly incorporated Syria. It might have incorporated part of Iraq as well. There are Christians throughout Iraq, whether they're in the empire or not. Okay. So at the time, it's 10% of the population is Christian before Constantine does this. okay? Over the course of the 4th century, now that it's legal, it really leads to a great number of more people converting to Christianity. And the Roman Emperor Theodosius, in the 380s, makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Okay? At the time, there are still some other religious traditions that are tolerated.
Such as?
Paganism is still tolerated, right? Greco-Roman paganism is still tolerated. Some of the mystery cults are still tolerated. But Christianity is Constantine privileged Christianity too, in terms of financial support and beginning a process of passing laws that reflected Christian morality. So, for example, Constantine ends gladiatorial contests, right?
Interesting.
Right. He gives a Christian who's being sued in court the option of having his case heard by the local magistrate or by his bishop.
Interesting.
Right. So he does things like this. It's the Roman Emperor Justinian in the 6th century who takes the idea of he sort of amplifies the idea that Christianity is the official religion of the empire to the point of actively persecuting not only non-Christian traditions, but versions of Christianity that don't reflect imperial orthodoxy. And he uses his armies to do it. Okay?
Wow.
Yeah. So we're in the 4th century, and this is the context. So by the 380s, which is what I'm going to talk about, right, because that's where our evidence comes from, by the 380s, maybe as much as half of the empire is at least nominally Christian. So you've gone. It's an enormous adjustment.
Sure.
You can have me back sometime, and we'll talk about how monasticism is actually the unexpected outcome of that adjustment.
Interesting.
Right, because I mean, just to tease that, right?
Please.
Basically, what happens is before Constantine, it's really, really difficult to be a Christian because the threat of persecution is always looming over you. So there are no pretend Christians, right? There are no Sunday morning only with grandma Christians, right? After Constantine legalizes Christianity and after Theodosius really invests in it, there are those Christians who think that it's become too watered down, right? That parish life isn't capturing what it meant to be a Christian in the 3rd century, in the age of persecution. And so monasticism becomes this vehicle by which Christians can live out a more rigorous.
Correct.
They think they're recapturing what it was like to be a Christian before Constantine.
Very interesting. I mean, just thinking of that, as you say that, you can see kind of the way church is done in a local parish.
Yes.
And the way church is done on Mount Athos or other monastic communities.
Right. Yes, that's right.
It's a definite, two different,
Yeah.
I mean, the core, the liturgy, Matin service, whatever we're doing is the same.
The claim and the ritual, right, the theological claim and the ritual is the same, but the extent to which one incorporates it into their every thought and their every action and so forth is very different. Yeah.
So this is, 380s-ish, Theodosius.
Yeah.
This is kind of the context now that we come to for tonight.
Yes.
So into this world we have entered.
And let me just give you a little more context to connect the dots. Like, who's alive in the 380s, right?
Okay.
So St. John Chrysostom is a deacon in Antioch.
Look at that.
Okay. St. Basil the Great has just died in the year 378. St. Gregory the Theologian.
These would have been known persons, Father.
Yes.
I mean, Dr.
Yeah. These are known persons. Well, St. Chrysostom would not yet be known.
Right. But Basil the Great would have been known.
Basil the Great was absolutely known, right?
And Gregory the Theologian, obviously.
Gregory the Theologian is the Archbishop of Constantinople in 381. Right, and then he goes into self-imposed exile and so forth, and he lives another 10 years, right? St. Athanasius the Great has died around the year 370. Maybe it's 371, I forget, right?
Okay.
So these are some of the people who are alive at this time. Okay. St. Ambrose is the Bishop of Milan. Alive is the Bishop of Milan in 381, right, 382. St. Gregory of Nyssa is still alive. St. Macrina, his sister, still alive, right? St. Augustine, in 380, St. Augustine is not yet a Christian, right? Well, in 380, I don't think he's a Christian. He converts to Christianity under Ambrose's tutelage. So at this point, he's probably a Manichaean, or he's making the transition from being a Manichaean to being a Christian, right? So again, just to connect the dots of what's going on.
Yeah,
okay, so why am I using the year 380? Okay. The oldest surviving account we have of anyone giving a diary-like account for what the liturgy looked like and what Christian rituals looked like, it's one source, and it's written by a woman by the name of Egeria. Now, what's remarkable about this, Father, is we don't have, other than letters, we don't have anything else written by a woman previous or for hundreds of years after this.
Unbelievable.
So it's an extraordinary, one-of-a-kind case. That doesn't mean that women didn't write.
Right.
It just means that it doesn't come down to us.
Was this written for someone?
Yes, so great question. Okay, so this Egeria is not from Palestine. She's not from Jerusalem. Egeria, most likely, we don't really know anything about her. Egeria most likely is from Gaul, southern France.
Bravo.
Okay?
Yeah. Where's Gaul?
Yeah, where's Gaul, right. Southern France, right?
Okay.
The south of France, Monte Carlo, right?
There you go.
And she is clearly from an aristocratic background because she can read and write. Okay?
Right.
Maybe 15% of the general population can read and write, and very few of them women. Okay? So she can read and write, and she has money to travel, right? As we were saying before, the majority of people in the 4th century would spend their entire lifetime within 15 or 20 miles of the place they were born.
Interesting.
Right? That's as far as they would travel. Soldiers would be different, but apart from soldiers and people who work for the imperial government and sailors, everybody else stays where they're born, right? But Egeria is the first known religious pilgrim, right? And she travels from Gaul through Rome, through Constantinople. She tells us about these places that she visits. I should say that not the whole text survives. We have the middle part. We don't know what's at the beginning. We don't know what's at the end. We have the middle part, okay? But it talks about her visit to Constantinople. It talks about her spending months in Jerusalem. So we know what an ordinary Sunday liturgy looks like. We know what an ordinary Orthros service looks like, a Vesper service. Right? We know what all of these services look like. We know what the Feast of the Holy Cross looks like because she talks about it.
In September.
In September, right? She doesn't really say anything about Christmas because it's not yet a big day in Palestine, right? The celebration of Christmas is a later development. She talks about Epiphany, right? Which was an ancient thing. So anyway, so what are we talking? We want to talk about Holy Week.
Before I forget, Father, I keep calling you Father, Doctor, would you be able to provide me with
the text?
an English translation?
Yeah, I assign it to my students every semester.
I think what I will do is either this evening or tomorrow, whenever I get it from Dr. George, I will share it with our community.
Absolutely.
So if you're not on our listserv, let me use this opportunity to say that you can visit our homepage, resurrectiongoc.org. You'll see us subscribe. If you subscribe, within the next 24 hours, you will get the text of our pilgrim here, our
Yeah.
first woman pilgrim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we don't know the precise year, but we know from other evidence that she's there somewhere between 380 and 385 or 386. Okay, and she gives us. Then she writes down a first-hand account of everything she witnesses.
Wow.
About the services. Throughout the year, but what we're going to talk about is Holy Week.
Holy Week.
Right. We're going to talk about Holy Week. And so some other things to know, right? Like, we Orthodox are very proud of the fact that our tradition is ancient, that our worship is ancient, and all of that is true.
Correct.
But what we probably don't realize is that the liturgy that we have, that we celebrate every Sunday, and the Orthros services and the Vesper services and the Holy Week services, those were very much put together over a very long period of time, right? And so many, if you know hymns and the kind of genres of hymns, many of the kinds of hymns that are the most common and the most frequently employed in Byzantium and in the Orthodox Church today have not yet been invented when Egeria is in Jerusalem. Okay, so a kind of hymn, my favorite, Kondakia, which are very elaborate, dramatized kinds of hymns.
So one famous kondakion that we sing during Lent is
The Akathist hymn.
the Akathist hymn that we
Right.
just did last Friday. That's
Right.
considered a kondakion, a series of hymns.
Stanzas. Yeah.
Thank you. Which, you heard last week.
Yeah.
Rejoice, rejoice, here nymphia,
Yeah.
nymphia here.
And let me, if I could, Father, let me explain what makes a kondakion so different than all the other hymns we sing. If you notice in the kondakia, if you pay attention to the words, what happens is it's always taking a biblical story and the characters of the biblical story, and it's almost like writing a fan fiction.
Interesting.
So you take the story, and then you elaborate on it with new dialogue between the characters that doesn't actually occur in Scripture. I mean, they'll include what is in Scripture, but they'll then expand upon it, right? So what happens in the Akathist is the angel says all of these things to Mary. Well, we don't know if that happened.
Right. At least not scripturally.
It's not in Luke, which is the only gospel where we even have Mary and the angel talking.
Right.
Right? And so the entire hymn is a kind of fan fiction, like it's a deliberate elaboration in the character's voice. And what's so fascinating about it, if you really want to study what's going on, is it's only in kondakia, or mostly only in kondakia, when the person singing sings in the personality of the biblical character. You're singing as the Theotokos, or you're singing as the archangel, right? Or you're in the Nativity one, which is so famous, of St. Romanos the Melodist. You're singing as the Magi. You're singing as Mary. You're singing as Joseph. In our other hymns, we sing about Mary. We sing about Joseph. We sing about the Magi. We don't sing from their perspective. Right? Anyway, that hasn't been invented yet. Right? So these kondakia don't exist. Okay? The most common hymn that we sing is a canon.
Correct.
Right? They're the most popular.
So just to give the viewers, that's the singing of the chanters before the Akathist, those hymns that comprises a canon to the Virgin Mary.
Yeah, but even our Orthros services and our Vesper services, more than anything else, they're filled with it's a specific kind of genre known as a canon. The canon are invented only after Islam. Right? They're invented at a monastery in Jerusalem, the Mar Saba Monastery in Jerusalem,
Famous.
after Islam. Right? And they're, again, call me back and we'll talk more about that, right?
Sure.
But there's a reason why the canon don't like what the kondakia are doing, because they're too elaborate, they're too dramatic. We need to go back to the basics and focus just on the words of Scripture and so forth, right? But none of that's been invented yet either,
Wow.
right? So what Egeria tells us in terms of the singing is that it's psalms. And in fact, the oldest, we know that there were some Christians, even St. Athanasius, Father, who thought that the only proper hymn for Christians was the Psalms.
Interesting. So,
Because it was biblical, right? That there shouldn't be the composition of additional hymns, right?
very interesting because we've been talking here at Holy Resurrection a lot too. Doctor, I don't want you to lose your train of thought, but we have what we call the prayer team 150. So during Lent, we have 150 people who every night
Oh, that's beautiful.
we will read, as a group, as a family. And we were talking about what would a young Jewish boy prayed like our Lord.
Yeah.
Is it safe? I mean, the Psalms.
The
Those
Psalms,
are the scriptures
absolutely.
that
The
people would have.
very earliest Christian services that occur, right? When they read the scriptures, the New Testament hadn't been written.
Correct.
They're reading,
Psalms.
they're reading the Psalms, they're reading the prophecies, they're reading the law, right? When we read the Didache, this is a text that Father would know, right? And they're talking about coming together for the agape service, right?
Which is the primitive
Which
liturgy.
is the primitive Eucharist.
Right.
And they're reading the scriptures, they're reading the Hebrew Bible, they're reading the Old Testament, right? And so the earliest Christian hymns are psalms.
And this is what you.
So Egeria testifies to the presence of psalms. She also testifies to the presence of antiphons. So let me explain what that is, okay? So if you know the Psalms, right in the middle of the Old Testament, okay, the Psalms are songs. They're ancient Jewish songs composed over hundreds of years, right? There's about 150 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like a song. They're like poetic lines, right? It's not a narrative, it's poetry, okay? And so what an antiphon is let's say the psalm is 10 lines long. You would read the first line of poetry. Now, they would be reading it in Greek, singing it in Greek, right? A Greek translation of the ancient Hebrew. They would be singing the first line, and then they would add a meditation of equal length. So you'd have 10 words from the first line of the psalm. You would have an 8 to 10 word meditation on that line. Then you would read sing the next line of the psalm, and then you would have another meditation on that line, right? And so that's what antiphons are.
So, just Doctor, just as a question.
Yeah.
Would you consider our Sunday Tes πρεσβείες της Θεοτόκου προσώτερσος όνειμας ευλόγη ψυχή μου τον Κύριον, where you inject a psalmic verse with a refrain.
That's precise.
Is that antiphonal?
That's exactly what it is.
Would Egeria have seen or heard that, or not quite exactly that?
You'd have to ask an actual liturgy specialist.
Okay.
So I'm a historian, not a liturgy specialist.
Okay. I was just wondering.
I don't know if that's as old as Egeria. It could. I know that it's old.
I know it's okay.
I know it's very old.
Okay.
Would she have heard it?
So here we're talking
don't
about
know.
psalmic verses with reflections sung on that verse. Next verse of the psalm, a next thing.
Right.
And is the idea antiphona that there were
it probably would have been everybody singing.
or everyone singing?
It probably would have been everybody singing. What you might have had is left and right side, right? It's a little unclear. We know that in many churches, there's a tradition, like you have in modern Greece, there's a tradition of men on one side and women on the other. Right? We know this even from the iconography of Ravenna, right? That the men are on one side and the women are on the other. How that would we do know that there were ancient women choirs, right? How this would have played out, she doesn't tell us. So it's really a bunch of guesswork, right?
So she hears antiphona.
And she simply says, so the entries for Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday are very short. Okay, they're very short. So there's no bridegroom service. There's no what's the hymn that we always repeat Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the beautiful one?
Yeah. Behold, the bridegroom
Yeah.
comes.
That's not there, right? That hasn't been written yet. For one thing, it's a canon, right? So it hasn't been written yet. So those aren't there. But so what she's talking about is.
So what does she see, Doctor?
Yeah, what does she see? So it's interesting because she's already detailed what happens on a normal day. Mm-hmm. Okay.
In previous writings.
In previous, like just throughout the year. So, and one of the things your viewers may not know, and you know, if you only come to church on Sundays, right, or right, as a general rule, and you're not familiar with the hour services, you probably don't know, well, what's this first hour, what's this third hour, what's the sixth hour, what does this mean? Well, what it means is it's the first hour after sunrise, or it's the third hour after sunrise, or it's the sixth hour after sunrise, or it's the ninth hour after sunrise. That doesn't work very well in Alaska during the winter, right? But you have to understand that these were all created in Jerusalem, right, where you don't have that problem, right? And so what she talks about for Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday is she literally just says the services of the hours and the Vesper and the Orthros follow their normal pattern.
Got it.
And they will do this special prayer, and they'll read us. And she doesn't even tell us what the prayers are. She says, and they will read certain prayers. But what's most interesting is she'll tell us where they're doing this.
Location-wise, you mean?
Location-wise.
Physical location.
Physical location.
Interesting.
Okay, so actually we should dwell on that for a second. Okay, so in our imagination, we probably think of Jerusalem as this huge city.
Right.
It's not. Okay, Jerusalem is, I mean, for the ancient Hebrews, yes, it's a very big city.
Right.
But by the time you have the Roman Empire, by comparison, it's tiny.
Oh, sure.
Right, it's no Rome, it's no Constantinople, it's no Alexandria, it's no Athens, right?
Sure.
It's no Antioch, Damascus, right? It's much, much smaller by comparison. And the most sacred sites all occur outside of the city walls. Okay? Jesus is crucified on Golgotha outside of the city. He's buried, right, in his tomb outside of the city. It was a Roman law that no one anywhere could be buried inside a city. There are no graveyards inside a city, period. It's unhealthy. Okay? So wherever you were in the Roman Empire, and at the time of Jesus, Palestine is part of the Roman Empire, no one would have been buried in Jerusalem. Okay? No one would have, well, I'm sure people were killed in Jerusalem, but the public executions took place outside of the city. Okay? So, but what Egeria tells us is at different points during Holy Week, so what they've done is they've gone and they've identified the actual sites where they believe these things happened. So they have Golgotha, and they have at the very spot where they believe the cross stood in the ground, they have developed an open-air shrine, because she even talks about the fact that they do services at the shrine whether it's raining or not.
Which would say that it's open air.
Which tells you it's open air, right? The tomb, right, was literally like carved out of the side of a cliff, okay? And at this point in the 4th century, what they've done with imperial funding, right, Constantine paid for it, they have built a kind of church that like the altar is basically where the tomb is, inside the cave, and they have built the Church of the Apostasy, the Church of the Resurrection, out from it. But they haven't like taken down the cliff, right? So it's still kind of just on the side of a rock wall, okay? And then they have, but that church is small. And then they have another church that they call the Martyrium. And all of these things, like you can walk from Golgotha to the Apostasy. And somewhere
how long would that have taken, just so people have a sense? 2-hour walk? Or
No. Maybe 10 minutes.
10 minutes. So close.
Close. Okay. It's probably a 45-minute walk to Jerusalem. Okay. For these things. But then she also tells us, so for example, at the Saturday of Lazarus, right, because that's where the account begins. We're kind of going out of order. But for the Saturday of Lazarus, what the entire community of Jerusalem does is they begin by having, I can't remember I'm going to get it wrong. I don't think they do the orthros. I can't remember. There is a church built on the site where Mary and Martha's house would have been. Or they believe Mary and Martha's house to have been.
The sisters
The
of
sisters of
Lazarus.
Lazarus. The sisters of Lazarus. And then there's another site outside of the city. Of course, it had to be outside of the
Because
city.
he was buried there.
Where Lazarus had been buried. And so for the Saturday of Lazarus, the Christians begin at one place, process to the other, and I believe they have I think they do the orthros at the first one, and then they do the Eucharistic service at the second one. But they're not done, and then they come back to the Church of the Anastasy, right?
On Lazarus.
On Lazarus Day, because there's always something at the Church of the Anastasy every day.
Right.
Every day there's something at the Church of the Anastasy.
Do we have a sense that she speak about the number of people? Like hundreds of people? Or?
So there are times when she says it's too many people to fit inside the church. Right? What does that mean? I'm not sure. Right? But she also talks about how long the services are, right? So on Good Friday, right? So for us today, right, we do our long gospel readings on Thursday night.
But which is the Matin service.
Yeah, right. Technically, right, because
Friday morning.
right. So for the Orthodox follow the ancient Jews in understanding the beginning of the day to be at sunset.
Correct.
Okay.
I actually say a few things about that.
Yeah.
Doctor, I don't want you to lose your thought though, but it's important for us to understand, we do services in Holy Week in the evening that are, say a few things,
okay.
just a couple seconds on
Right.
that, because
So
that's important.
in exceptions were always made, and they try to, they don't have digital clocks, right? They don't have iWatches, right?
Right.
Things like this to get the precise time right. But as a general principle, they understand the day to begin at sundown and Vespers to begin at sunset. Okay? Vespers begins at sunset, technically. Okay? Technically, Orthros begins at sunrise. Matins begins at sunrise. Or the sunrise occurs during Orthros. Okay? And then your first, third, sixth, ninth hours follow the sunrise. Okay? So what I was saying is that, so for a variety of pastoral reasons, right, and traditions that grew over time, right? Tradition isn't a static thing. Tradition's a living thing. It's always evolving. But coming out of the Byzantine period and into the Turkish period and so forth, right, which is when we developed the Holy Week service as we now have it, right? So we still follow the tradition of sunset begins the next day. So for us, what is, according to the calendar, Thursday night is really liturgically Friday morning.
That's right. I think that's an important piece of information. We in Holy Week are gathering in the evening.
Yes.
Let's say Holy Thursday night, so that we can really remember the service. The 12 Gospels are actually, that service is the following morning's Matin or Orthros service.
Right.
And probably for pastoral reasons, we have transposed that to the evening before in order to accommodate, I'm guessing, the needs of the people.
So that you can bring more people who have to work and
Because I don't think any of us would be on Holy Friday morning spending 4 hours in the morning at church reading Gospels.
Yes. But what's so amazing is Eugenia does.
Yeah.
Right?
Look at that.
And she's talking about Like
So
they're
she's speaking about Holy Friday morning
she's speaking about Friday during the day,
during the day.
and they are reading for hours. Basically, they're just reading and rereading and rereading, like the various gospel passages, right? And it goes on forever. And then it's psalms, and it's antiphonal singing, and it's prayers. We don't know what the prayers are because those aren't written down anywhere. But these services are going on for hours and hours and hours. And there's no pews,
Right.
right? There's no pews, there's no chairs, and it's going on for hours, right? And
Is there any reference to Eucharistic the liturgy? Like,
so not on Friday. So okay, so
'cause that would
not
be
not,
a
not on
great
Friday.
difference
Yeah,
of-
no, not on Friday.
On
What
Friday.
is interesting is on Thursday. So Thursday, they have. I mean, today we do pre-sanctified, but they don't even have the idea of pre-sanctified
Sure.
yet. Okay.
Fair.
They have a normal liturgy Thursday morning. Okay, but that's not the one that
do
we
as
think
a-
of.
You're right.
Okay, they're just doing it because it's Thursday and it's just a day and they're doing it.
Would they have associated that, Doctor, with the Last Supper?
Not yet, because what they are going to do is, now if I get this right, so one of the things they do is they're constantly moving.
Okay.
Right, they're moving from this Martyrium church, which is large enough to accommodate a lot of people, to the Church of the Anastasis, which, depending on when you're talking about, isn't that big, right? But they're also going to all kinds of other places, right? So apparently they had identified a place outside of Jerusalem, but not here, somewhere like on the other side of Jerusalem, where Christ was accustomed to teaching his disciples. And I forget what the name of the field is or whatever, but they've built a shrine there too. Apparently, there was a cave near, and Jesus and the disciples would kind of hide there, right? Or hide might be the wrong word, but they would sort of move out of everyone's attention so that he could give them instruction and teaching. And so the Christians would move from the Golgotha Anastasis area to go there during Holy Week, right? And they would do their antiphons and their psalms and their this and that. Well, anyway, I don't remember if it's on the way there or on the way back. On Thursday before sunset, because otherwise it would be Friday, they received the Eucharist to commemorate the Last Supper at Golgotha, right? So at the site of the cross. And they bring the relic of the cross to it, right? And they receive the Eucharist there. So there's not even a church there, but so they're receiving it outside at that site. And then from there, they all go to the Garden of Gethsemane, right? So this is now
The Last Supper?
so right. So this is now Thursday night into Friday morning.
Yeah.
So they're going. So they receive the Eucharist there, the Last Supper. They go to Golgotha and they stay all night. They stay up all night, right, reading and singing and doing that, right, all of this stuff. And then an hour or so before daybreak, they begin to march back to the Anastasis, and they're all exhausted, right? And they do their orthros service, and then they're sent home to sleep for 2 hours. But mind you, it takes them 40 minutes just to walk back to Jerusalem, right? Maybe to get something to eat.
Right.
And then,
That's true. We didn't
right?
think of that. What are they eating, the poor people?
And then they come back again, and then they begin that unbelievably long litany of gospel readings.
And the Ngomia?
And
They didn't have Ngomia.
well, they don't have Ngomia yet. They don't have Ngomia yet. The Ngomia are actually quite late, probably 13th, 14th, 15th century, right? Wow.
So they're reading what there? Just gospel?
They're reading gospel passages about the Passion, and they're reading gospel passages about the Passion, and probably Christ. We don't know. She doesn't tell us exactly.
What the, yeah.
The oldest, so we do have other sources that help fill in the blanks. Unfortunately, they're not Greek, right? So all of this is taking place in Greek, but you're already beginning to attract pilgrims from all over the Christian world, permanent pilgrims, right? we know that St. Jerome left Rome and came to Jerusalem because he wanted to be in Jerusalem, right? We have people coming from Georgia. We have people coming from Armenia. So the oldest surviving lectionary. So a lectionary is a Bible that's kind of written out of order, rather than it be, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, right, in sequence. A lectionary or a gospel lectionary carves up the Bible into the readings that you would read throughout the year according to a calendar, okay? The oldest surviving Christian lectionary is in Armenian. It's called the Jerusalem Armenian Lectionary, okay? And it's probably from a century later. And it would reflect what is going on in Greek practice, but translated into Armenian to accommodate Armenian pilgrims. Mm-hmm. Similarly, the oldest surviving the oldest surviving chant book that we have. All right, I know you love this, Father.
This is my.
No, you've got. I have. My friend is the one who translated this. The oldest surviving chant book that we have is in Georgian.
Wow.
Okay, and it's in 3 different parts, and the oldest part is the Sunday liturgies. So it's already in the oktoiktos form, so the 8 different tones that the church sings, and it is the Vesper, Orthros, liturgy sequence in all 8 tones in Georgian. And so you don't have canons, because canons haven't been invented. You don't have Tropadia. You don't have Apolitikia. None of these kinds of hymns have been invented yet. What you have are they're poetic, so they look kind of like psalms. They vary between 4 and 8 or 9 lines, and they are almost exclusively focused on the resurrection, every single hymn. Okay? And it is a Georgian translation of contemporary Greek, probably dating to the 5th or 6th century. And here's the thing that's going to blow you away and why you're going to want to read this. 80% of those hymns that survive, that are in that Georgian chant book, we have no other evidence for.
Oh, wow.
So in other words, the hymns that Eugenia is hearing, we don't
know.
We don't know because they've been lost, because they were replaced as new subgenres of Greek hymnography developed. So our best access to knowing what was sung at the Church of the Anastasy is this Georgian chant book.
Remarkable.
And there's an English translation of it. I'll buy you one.
Thank you. Are they? Do you know if they're used today in the Georgian Orthodox Church, or is it kind of just?
I don't know. I
fell out of practice?
Probably not, actually, but I'll find. That's a great question, but I'll find out. Yeah.
That's so interesting, Doctor.
Yeah.
I mean, again, we have the context. We light our candles. We have seats. We don't move. We come to one church. The picture you're painting. The movement of this kind of group of Christians to different sites, reciting long hours of Scripture, receiving the Eucharist, reliving the steps of Christ, in some instances pretty accurately, but also there's a little bit looseness, going to have the Eucharistic, at Golgotha,
Right.
They didn't find the site of the Last Supper to go and sit and eat,
Right. And all of these things are evolving, right? I'm certain that it didn't look like this 30 years before her, right? And it probably didn't look like this 30 years after her.
Not. But does she describe the clergy? Does she describe? Do you have any recollection?
So it's interesting. She doesn't say anything about vestments. Except that maybe at a particular point the bishop will put on something. Mm-hmm. What's fascinating is I don't remember it so much for the Holy Week services, but throughout the year, right? So what happens on an ordinary Sunday is the bishop kind of shows up late. Like everybody's there, right? Everybody's there, and they're doing their orthro service, they're doing this, and then they'll say, and they have to wait for the bishop, right? And then the bishop comes, and they'll be in the Church of the Apostasy, and he goes behind the rail, and then he does this or that, and then he says a prayer, and then they dismiss everybody. So like they're there for hours, and the bishop's there for like 15 minutes. It's like, what's he doing?
Right. How funny. Nowadays, the bishop arrives and the service goes on and on, right? So it's a flip of the ancient practice. So you've taken us to Good Friday,
Yeah.
long scriptures.
Yeah,
Today
long scriptures. And the other thing I want to note about Good Friday, and actually we just published an article about this in a journal we run at the center. She also has this really interesting line about the wailing of the people.
What does that mean?
Well, it has to do with their mourning the suffering of Christ. Okay? And what's interesting about that...
Well, you're making me think now. Miroloya and things like this.
Well, but what's really interesting about that, and I had a student at Fordham write a dissertation on this. Before Kondakia, okay, we have no evidence of any kind of encouragement of grief or mourning. In fact, we have the exact opposite. So if you read St. Chrysostom, or if you read Cyril of Jerusalem, who would have been the bishop when Eugenia is visiting, right? They go to great length to talk about why it's wrong to grieve, right? Why it's wrong to mourn. You shouldn't mourn Christ on the cross, right? You shouldn't mourn, right? Jesus didn't mourn, right? They have trouble handling the passage because the gospel passage says Jesus wept, right, when he finds out that Lazarus died. But they go out of their way to figure that in a way that won't lead the population to do this sort of thing. Now, there were ancient mourning practices. People would go on and on and on and on and on. And Christian theologians, maybe not Christian people, but the theologians are taking a much more stoic approach, right? If you believe in the resurrection, then you shouldn't be sad. You shouldn't have grief. You shouldn't have this. You shouldn't even grieve Christ on the cross because it's all for the good. Right? To grieve Christ on the cross is to misunderstand what's going on, like the apostles, right? They misunderstand, right? And so the theologians who comment on these things are all saying, don't grieve, don't grieve, don't grieve. But Eugenia, in one sentence, tells us that they're wailing as these things are being read, right? So it's this kind of fascinating insight, right? As a historian, I love getting a sense for what actual ordinary Christians are doing that can fill in or sometimes even correct what the elites tell us they should be doing. Right? It gives us a fuller picture, I think, of early Christianity. And from my own perspective, I think it helps me in the 21st century to realize that everybody in the 4th century wasn't perfect, right? They had their same doubts, they had their same struggles, they had their same thing. It makes it all so much more real for me, right? So anyway, that's just an interesting thing about that Friday passage.
You bring this to mind, and for our viewers, what Dr. George is referencing, these little comments on the side that to a reader of the 4th century, oh yeah, we know that. Yeah. But what it reveals about everything, because I remember reading a text, Doctor, I think it was on a liturgy which was happening in St. Sophia, the great cathedral in Constantinople, and I think there's like a reference, something to the effect, and don't quote me, well, those under penance were in the second narthex, but the penitents who, those individuals, some other category, they were up more close to the front. Now, that means nothing other than like, whoa. what do you mean there were distinctions of where those under penance were standing in church, like, and those other groups, and then another group that had access to the main church,
Yeah.
That's such an insight,
Yeah.
especially to a historian. That's the kind of keys he's looking for to open
Yeah,
other
yeah,
doors.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
how come these separations? Who defined these separations? Why these separations?
And it's right. You don't write down what you take for granted,
Right.
right? And so thank God, right? I mean, thousands and thousands of people saw this in Jerusalem, and none of
Correct.
them wrote it down.
Right.
Thank God, Egeria came all the way from France
And said,
and took notes so that she could go back. She's a nun. I don't think I mentioned that,
No.
right?
Oh, she's a nun.
So she comes from aristocratic background. It's almost certain that she's a nun because she's writing for a female ascetic community back in Gaul, right? So what she wants to do is she wants them to imitate in Gaul, in France, what's going on in Jerusalem. And so that's why she's kept this sort of liturgical travelogue of everywhere that she's been. And thank God she did, or we wouldn't know what it was like, right?
that's Friday.
That's Friday, right? And then Saturday, the Saturday night is like what we're familiar with, right? Everybody shows up in the middle of the night and
At the Anastasi
at
Church.
of course the Church of the Anastasi, right? And they come out with the candles and the singing the Christ, right? And they're screaming Christ is risen and so forth, right? And I was just reminded today by something else that I read. That phrase Christ is risen. The first person to say it is Mary Magdalene. When Mary Magdalene, right, because Mary Magdalene is the first to arrive at the empty tomb. She's told by the angel to go back. And when she goes and sees the apostles, she's the first that says, Christ is risen. Right?
Interesting. Beautiful, beautiful. Veve. It's, well, I don't know what to say, Doctor, other than, you walked us. Maybe for some of our viewers, words like orthros and matins are a bit foreign. Hopefully, you have been teased enough through this evening's conversation, and we appreciate, Doctor, your manner of delivery, this is what we want. Even on the show Living the Resurrection, we did a whole series, let's say on the Divine Liturgy or whatever. It's meant to be for the person in the pew,
Of course.
not a high, lofty theological, because I'm going to ask Doctor offline about any kind of theological nuances in the text that he may have seen, which would be, just for my own edification. But we really thank you. This evening was a walk into the 4th century. I don't want to cut you if you have anything else
that's
that you
good.
want to add, but I do look forward to receiving the text.
Yeah,
And I will
absolutely.
definitely share it out to our viewers. Yes, there is a continuation of the story of the way, for example, today, even on Mount Athos, they actually read the orthros that we do the 12 Gospels on Friday morning. They retain the actual, what you were saying, the first hour after sunrise, the third hour, the 6th, the 9th, and so on and so forth. And I had a friend who recently went to Mount Athos for Holy Week and was like, wait, what's going on here? And he said it was different, but had a grace to it, to do Holy Week the way it, quote, should be done. We look forward to learning more about our faith. Doctor, this is part of why we did this, is to try to make accessible to the person in the pew the truths of our faith that are so beautiful. We have such a rich liturgical life. Dr. George spoke about the chanting, the modes, the hymnology of Holy Week, the putting in the mouth of the Virgin Mary, how can I behold you, my son, hanging from a cross like a thief? We'll hear that on Holy Thursday night. And so many other hymns, the Apokathilos is the drama of taking Christ down from the cross.
Right.
You realize that in ancient practice, they had an icon of the crucifix. There was no real-size crucifix, put through the church or other kinds of things like that. We realize, Doctor touched upon it, there were little nuanced differences, maybe even more than nuanced differences, but great differences in the imperial city, in Jerusalem, in monastic life. So there was a development of liturgical practice, no doubt. So all these things.
Yeah, if I could, one thing
Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to say about that is we tend to presume that they did liturgy the same way everywhere.
Correct.
Even in Byzantium, even after these things get developed, even after they develop all of these hymns and so forth, you still have extraordinary liturgical variation. What we don't appreciate is it's actually the printing press that brings it in to liturgical variation.
And when was
It's
the printing
nothing
press?
else. Yeah?
When was the printing press?
The printing press is the late 15th century, and it's the 16th century before the Orthodox really have access to it. And at that point, they're already under Ottoman rule.
Right.
Right? It's the printing press. It's not an imperial decree. It's not a patriarchal decree. It's the printing press that standardizes liturgy.
I think the sequel to this evening's lecture will be to bring a Byzantine musicologist
Oh, yes,
to
that
the
would be
show
good. That would
to
be
tell
good.
us about the hymns of Holy Week
Yes, that would be
and
great.
the development of what was there. Well, Doctor,
Yeah.
I don't think I have words to thank you.
Oh, it's
This
my,
was
it's
a
my pleasure.
beautiful
It's always good to be
evening,
with you.
and especially as we prepare for the week of weeks, Holy Week, we wish all of God's blessings upon you and upon your family,
Thank you, Father.
that you will be strengthened by the week ahead, that you will love Christ more, that you will dedicate your life even more to Christ and His gospel and His truth, because this is the essence of our lives here. I'm more of the St. Cyprian theology. We look beyond the cross, knowing that our Lord won it in the end for
Very
us.
nice.
So to our viewers, on behalf of Holy Resurrection, we wish you a most blessed Pascha. You know that our motto has been these weeks, make church your home this Pascha. That's what we've been saying, Doctor. Make church your home this Pascha. And we look forward to seeing you in church. And wherever you are and whoever you are, go to your home, which is your local church. This is very important, especially now, especially a year after COVID. God be with you and God bless you.
Thank you,
Good
Father.
doctor.